I'm going to introduce our speaker now. He found his first dinosaur bone at the age of 7. He grew up in Montana, and this began a lifelong interest in geology and paleontology. I won't steal too much of his thunder, but he's come all the way from Seattle, Washington. He has done extensive field study in the Pacific Northwest, the Midwest, the Plains States, Southwestern U.S., and most recently Israel. He does a lot of classes and seminars for homeschools and church conventions. He leads geology field trips every year, including one to Yellowstone Park, where he helps families uncover and discover the biblical geology of such formations. He's got a lot of books in back. I bought a couple, much to my wife's chagrin. My collection keeps growing. But there are a number of these books that are great resources. I encourage you to check them out. Rock Identification Field Guide, Fossil Identification Made Easy, the Geology of Yellowstone, Geology for Kids. There's many titles back there. So sorry for taking so long to introduce him, but would you please help give a warm welcome to Mr. Patrick Nurre.
Well, to begin with, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a KU boy, by the way. And I am a dyed-in-the-wool Jayhawk. I wear my Jayhawk sweatshirt around all the time. In fact, I need to pick one up here, hopefully before we leave town, because mine's wearing out. And I married a Kansas girl. Now, she was also KU, but she started out at K-State. Her father was a professor of biochemistry at K-State and retired a number of years ago. They still live there, but she couldn't make it here. She does accompanying work for the Columbia Children's Choir in Seattle, and so she was obligated for some things. But I do miss her, and I'm sure you would really enjoy seeing her if she was here, as all Kansas girls are. I love Kansas girls. They're great. But anyway, I grew up in the state of Montana, and right on the edge of the dinosaur beds. And I had lots and lots of opportunity to do a lot of digging, and I've found lots of bones. And I've led quite a number of field trips out into the areas where they've found the big T-Rexes and Triceratops and Edmontosaurus and some of the other big dinosaurs out there. And so we try to get out there about every other year near Glendive, Montana, and take families out there to understand how the biblical history can explain some of these things. I do get around a lot to primarily homeschool groups all over the country and in Canada, as a matter of fact. But it's really driven by one passion, and that's really to help this next generation of warriors for Christ, young kids, really understand that Genesis can be taken literally, historically, and can interpret the landforms that we see around us. It's amazing how much literature has been written over the last 30 years on creation-type topics, thousands of books. And yet I have contact with hundreds of kids every year, and they can't put the pieces together. They know the stories, they know the flood, they know the creation, but they can't understand how those things explain what we see today. And so they resort a lot to books from the library and so on, and it creates a huge conflict in their faith. And that's not going to help at all in the future. Things are doubling down, especially from the scientific community. There are movements afloat to keep people from earning science degrees that embrace a young earth and a global flood. Even Dawkins, a famous atheist, has suggested that to teach kids the concept of a young earth and a global flood be a crime. And so there's a lot of stuff coming down the pike, and we've got to equip our kids to understand how the Bible fits reality and not have one foot in a myth and one foot in the resurrection, which is where I was when I became a believer. I was trained in secular geology. I loved it. I went everywhere as a kid. In fact, it's how I stayed out of trouble, frankly, was all the geology field trips that were made available, primarily through the Montana Historical Society. And we went everywhere in Montana. And I read a number of books, old books from the famous geologists and paleontologists. My mother was a county librarian for Bighorn County. I'd spent a lot of my Saturdays in there reading those old books. And they really built my foundation in geology. But they also did one other thing, and that was to undermine the faith that I was being taught. And I remember asking a question one day to a pastor, and I asked him, look, I love my church, and I also love science. So tell me, when did Neanderthal become Adam and Eve? It was a good question. When I was a kid, this Neanderthal back then was considered a missing link. And he said, well, it's really not that important. Don't worry about it. Just believe what the church teaches and you'll do fine. Well, first of all, as a rebellious junior high student, that's just not a good answer. It's not going to work. And I started drifting and came to KU primarily out of rebellion at first. It's a very liberal school. But that's where I became a believer. And then after I became a believer, I began to ask the question, okay, I've got to put this together. Either the Bible is entirely true or all of it's suspect. And that's what I had to resolve. And I did resolve it and then began working on it so that I could help especially families. So I've been doing this now for over 40 years. And I've written now 13 books. We just finished our lab for the Geology for Kids back there. But it's to help from pre-K all the way through high school. So by the time your kids leave home, they're equipped and prepared for what lies ahead of them. And it's going to be an onslaught. So tonight we're going to look at the dinosaur hunters. And here's the major question we kind of want to look at here, and that is this: do paleontologists have a worldview? Now, everybody has a worldview. A worldview is just the way you look at the world. It's how you define things. It's what determines how you're going to believe about something. I run into a lot of scientists, though, who, although might admit they have a value system, they swear that that does not affect their judgment. And of course, it's not science to let a worldview affect and influence how you think. But your worldview influences everything you think about, everything you do. You may not be able to craft it together, but I bet if you sat down long enough and just took a pencil, started writing out, what do you believe about the world? What do you believe about God? What do you believe about the flood? What do you believe about creation? Where did you come from? Your worldview would come out very, very quickly. And I think there's a real history in especially hunting for dinosaurs. Now, these creatures have supposedly been the foundation for establishing an evolutionary worldview. These are the big, big bones and big creatures, and the public loves them. And we're going to look at this. But I've wondered about this guy here, and I have tried to figure out where he came from and how we got this critter here. It's just a mystery to me. There are no bones that are being found. Paleontologists have not discovered any remains of this creature. But here's my thinking. Actually, I think he's some kind of a theropod, meat-eating dinosaur with feathers. That's what I believe. Anyway, paleontology really is not exactly an exact science. Paleontologists, depending on who you talk to, can look at the same pile of bones and see something entirely different and interpret it entirely different. And it just depends on who rules the day. That's what gets defined. And this one here is a good one. I like this one, that why the dinosaurs weren't around on the ark here. The stupid brutes, But this quote is very interesting from the book Hunting Dinosaurs. This one is displayed in every national park. And so I decided to pick it up one day. This was in Dinosaur National Monument a year ago when I was there. And I decided to go ahead and just look at it. It looked intriguing. And as I read through this book, boy, was it revealing. But anyway, this paleontologist says, being a paleontologist is like being a coroner, except all the witnesses are dead and all the evidence has been left out in the rain for 65 million years. I mean, what can you construct from that? What can you say from that? What can you conclude from that? Everything has been affected. I read an article not too long ago on the dinosaur bones of the Morrison Formation. Now, the Morrison Formation is huge. It includes Canada, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, and so on. And it's where most of the dinosaur bones in the world have been found, is in the Morrison Formation. And some scientist was working with the guys at Los Alamos and had told them that they'd discovered a new way to prospect the bones out of the rock, get the bones out of the rock. Sometimes the bones and the rock look like a lot like each other. So he said every bone in the Morrison Formation, this is quite a huge area. The total square mileage is around 600,000 square miles. Now that's a lot of area to be affected by one event. And he said that every one of the dinosaur bones in Morrison Formation are fluorescent. In other words, they've been infiltrated with uranium. So uranium has leached into these bones. Now, how is that going to affect the story? That is very intriguing, isn't it? Just to let you know where I'm coming from, I do believe in a straightforward reading of Scripture, and that a straightforward reading of Scripture tells me that we have a young earth, and that soon after it was created, about 1,600 years after it was created, was flooded by a global flood. And that global flood explains the rock layers that we see all around us. That's been my passion and my study for the last 40 years. And every place we go that has rock layers, I've got pictures of them. And I've tried to put a lot of them in the books out here to explain different points. But the flood is really the key to this entire whole controversy. If the flood happened, then it is just almost moot to talk about a lot of other issues. Now, it's very clear as we look at this whole issue that there are two different stories being told about dinosaurs. They're very different. One is an evolutionary view, and it's quite different from the biblical view. If you look at both stories and just face value, surface, straightforward reading, two entirely different views. They can't be compromised. Neither one will compromise, although the church has at times in the past done it. I do not feel that I can do that and not be an honest believer. But it's sure thing that the evolutionists are not going to compromise their faith. But they're two different stories. Now, they present two different presentations of Earth history, and they tell two diametrically opposite stories. We have to realize that. To try to harmonize and put the two together just simply will not work. Now, I want you to understand the historical context here for the dinosaur hunters, and that is this: it is modern geology. Many people think that Darwin was the one who started the whole ball rolling, and is actually geology, modern geology, which started in the late 1700s, really got a start in the late 1700s, progressed into the 1800s, and Darwin then, this is what gave him, it's kind of an epiphany he had. Oh, this explains why then we have changing animals over periods of hundreds of millions of years, perhaps. It's the time consideration. This was the whole idea in modern geology. Erase the short time frame of Genesis, and you have a whole different view of geology. And that's what these guys tried to do. The beginning of modern geology really happened with two men in particular. One, James Hutton, who's called the father of modern geology, and another fellow by the name of Charles Lyell. He's often called the White Knight of geology. He almost single-handedly eliminated Genesis from consideration when it came to talking about the flood. By the late 1800s, there wasn't one scriptural geologist left. I would say that Lyell was pretty powerful and pretty influential. He was an attorney, and he was very eloquent, and he affected modern geology. All of modern geology is based right in this man right here. Now, a lot of people ask, well, why did this take place? I mean, was this because of a scientific revolution that went on? And it really wasn't. I don't think we study this enough. I've checked a lot of school books for what we do with this period of called the Enlightenment. This Enlightenment really influenced modern geology, that man should not be dependent on any kind of religion, God, or holy book to figure out his story. The Enlightenment really influenced this guy named James Hutton, the father of modern geology. He concluded that the earth is older than what the Bible says. In fact, his reason was because it looks older. Now, that's not a very scientific conclusion, but that's what he said, nevertheless. And so he rejected the young earth chronology. Charles Lyell came along, and he said the earth was shaped by geological processes over millions of years. So now you have the rejection of the biblical flood. It's kind of a building stair step, if you will. And then, of course, the crown was Charles Darwin, who believed that life then originated and evolved naturalistically. And so this rejected the biblical creation account. And guess what? It's no surprise that we have our modern age, where the God, the Bible, the church is irrelevant. It's a complete rejection of the Bible. It's God and its morality. No wonder. I mean, this is what our modern society has been built on all of these years. And it's sobering to think of what could happen in the next 10 to 20 years as things get more and more entrenched. Every once in a while, I'll have people to ask me, look, this is not really an important subject. It's not necessary for salvation. I agree. I agree 100%. But it is important in that throughout church history, there have been times when the church has had to deal with certain issues that it just couldn't get beyond until it solved it. First couple of 100 years, the issue was the person of Christ. Who is he? They had to resolve that before the church could really move on. And the church has had its periods like this all throughout history. I firmly believe that this is another one of these times that we live in, where the church has got to step up to the plate and define some things and do some training. And I think we're way, way behind the 8 ball on this whole thing. But it's very, very important. Now, in effect, paleontology has been a quest to find our evolutionary roots in the fossils. A fossil hunter goes out with a preconceived idea. And I'll be the first to admit that's my worldview. So when I go out into Glendive and take field trips out there and look for dinosaur bones, I expect to find disarticulated dinosaur bones that are all broken up and spread all over. I expect to find bones mixed with marine creatures. Why? Because of my worldview. We had a flood. And sure enough, this is what we find. Paleontologists do the same thing with their historical worldview, and that is the uniformitarian perspective. And they use that as their interpretive device. But here's the real thing, and this particular evolutionist is very, very open. I love it when they're honest with me. That's all I want them to do, is just be honest with me. And he said this: we take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Isn't that interesting? A prior commitment. They accuse us of having a prior commitment to the scriptures. That's true. They have a prior commitment to materialism. That is the one worldview I've heard some paleontologists admit to. I have only one worldview. The world is entirely material. That's it. Then he goes on to say, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, that we are forced by our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Moreover, that materialism is an absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Now, that is a worldview. And this is what we have to be prepared to do battle with. It is not, let me tell you, it is not science versus the Bible. It never has been. It is religion versus religion. There is no disagreement. When I work with geologists, secular geologists on the science, field science, it's very interesting. We never disagree when we're looking at a piece of granite from Yosemite or something. We identify the minerals in it. We identify the glacial patterns and so on. The science, no disagreement on science. As soon as we shift the conversation to origins, it's World War III. That tells me we've just left the science field and we've gotten into religion or philosophy. So that's really the battle that we're facing, not science and religion. That pits two things together that don't belong together. There is no disagreement in the science. It's religion versus religion. Now, as we move to the paleontology, the dinosaur bones, first guy really to invent the word dinosaur was this guy here, Sir Richard Owen, 1842. Although the word means terrible lizard, and that's what it does mean in the Greek language, dinosaurs are not considered lizards today. They're not considered to be reptiles, and they're not considered to be mammals. There's a lot of controversy here over these creatures. What are they? Well, it just really kind of depends on who you talk to. And there are some paleontologists that have written books. I have over 100 books on my shelf, secular books on dinosaurs. And they all say different things. It's whoever holds the ball. That's the way the game works. And it's whoever holds the ball in any particular given area. But Sir Richard really thought, and he named them dinosaurs for this particular reason. He really felt like they were like the modern monitor lizard. And so he called them terrible lizards. He's holding here, seen holding the bone of a megalosaurus found in the 1600s. It actually wasn't scientifically described until much later. All right, so megalosaurus. Now here's the very first dinosaur, remains the very first dinosaur found and then scientifically described. Do you have any idea what he might look like? I mean, I could give you a sketchbook and you'd all probably come up with different ideas. Well, this is what he looked like in the 1800s. This was the first dinosaur to be classified and studied. That's what Megalosaurus was pictured as by the artists. Here's what he looks like today. The modern Megalosaurus is mostly a hypothetical head. No complete skeleton has ever been found. Artistic renditions are fired by the imagination of paleontologists who have been influenced by their evolutionary and old Earth worldview of dinosaurs. We have no idea what the critter looked like. We can imagine, and so long as we're honest about our imagination, it's not a problem. But this is then presented as this is the enlightened view. Another set of very interesting fossils was found in 1822. These are some fossil teeth, and they were thought by some to be fish. No complete skeletons were known at the time. And in fact, because so little was known about them, the particular discoverer sent these teeth off to the great Cuvier. Now, Cuvier was like the Einstein of this time. He's a brilliant paleontologist and anatomist. He was the go-to guy in science for this time. He thought that they were from a rhinoceros. Now, Owen went back to it and declared, no, I think they're from they look like the modern iguana teeth, and so they were given the name iguanodon or iguana tooth. And you'll notice a little point on his head there. You see that? We'll look at this one here. There it is, that little point. Well, he really thought that one of those bones in that lot belonged on the snout. And so you can see that, and that was the picture of the iguanodon in the 1800s. This is how they pictured iguanodon. Now, these are some of the artist renditions of the time. There's the iguanodon. You see the little horn on his nose. And there's the horn. And here was a modern, at that time, artist rendition of Megalodon or Megalosaurus and Iguanodon doing battle. This was 1863. Well, very, very interesting. If you know anything about Iguanodon, it doesn't look anything like this today. And that's because the greatest dinosaur find in all of history took place in 1878. And this was a major, major find. There were 11 complete skeletons and 20 less complete skeletons of this creature that would become Iguanodon, found in a coal mine 1,000 feet down in Belgium. Now, this has been called the greatest dinosaur find in history. Now, here are the real questions, though. We're starting to define Iguanodon here, but here are the real questions I have. Number one, how did so many dinosaurs die at the same time? And that's not normal. That's not normally how death takes place. There had to be some kind of a catastrophe that took place to dump so many dinosaurs together. Number two, how did so many skeletons come to be buried without being scavenged or torn up over the supposed length of time needed for fossilization and coalification? The process of coal, masses of plant material, and mass burial of animals really is produced more, it's explained better really by a catastrophe of water and sediment burial. But anyway, Iguanodon was erected, and this is what he looked like in 1878. Now you'll notice they finally figured out where the spike goes. That was the thumb of his hand. And so this is how they pictured him in 1878. And but several years have gone by, and scientists question that. So now this is what Iguanodon looks like. He was repositioned, and because they felt like this was the better way to portray him. So here we have the picture of Iguanodon 1878, and then now. What a difference. So the big question here, are these changes due to advancements in science and technology, or do they reflect the fact that guessing plays a huge part in modern paleontology? And we don't really know much of anything about these beasts. We really don't. One of my favorite questions is to ask kids when they come in. We have a life-size replica of a T-Rex skull in our museum back in the Seattle area. Kids will come through the door and their eyes will get bigger than silver dollars. You know, they'll use, oh, T-Rex. And, okay, so how many of you think T-Rex was a ferocious meat eater? And they all raise their hands. Okay, why do you think that? Well, because of his teeth. Okay, well, what is the panda bear? Does the panda bear have sharp teeth? Yeah, the panda bear has sharp. What is he? Is he a ferocious meat eater? No, he eats bamboo. And I said, okay, do you enjoy going to McDonald's? And, oh, yeah, no, we love McDonald's. Do you just order the bun and the cheese? Is that all you get? Oh, no, we get the bun, the hamburger, the whole works. So are you some kind of ferocious meat eater? You don't have sharp teeth. And the point of that whole discussion was this. We've never observed a T-Rex. No one has ever kept a T-Rex to see exactly what his mating habits are, his eating habits. And there have been equally as many shifts in the paleontological community about what T-Rex was like. Some thought he was a ferocious meat eater. Some feel that he was a scavenger. Some really place him in a different category. We really don't know much about these beasts. Now, very interesting, there's a dinosaur to bird connection here along the time of Darwin. He came out with his book, The Origin of Species, and this book just shook the world. It was probably the most influential book in all of human history, I would say, other than the Bible. It's very, very influential. And the church was madly scrambling to try to figure out how to deal with this, because this was the current scientific thinking. How are we going to deal with this? Now, Darwin's views are revolutionary because he viewed life this way, as kind of a tree where everybody was related and then shared a common ancestor. So you've got birds related to dinosaurs, man related to dinosaurs, to ape-like creatures, and so on. And this was a tough tough thing to accept. The only problem is that Darwin needed tons of fossil links to prove his ideas. He had to figure out how non-living matter would evolve into a living cell. He had to figure out how an invertebrate would come from a living cell, evolve into a fish, evolve into an amphibian, and then evolve into reptiles, birds, mammals, and eventually humans. So this was a big task. If you sit down and try to put this on paper, how many changes do you think have to happen among all these various groups of living things to produce other living things that are functioning entirely on their own? Masses of fossils must be found. And paleontology did not exist as a science during this time. So the big question was, where do we find these fossils? And one of the biggest advocates for Darwin, of course, was Thomas Huxley. You've probably heard of him. He's called Darwin's bulldog. You know, there's a guy with some worldview, isn't there? And he took up the challenge. And it just so happened that in 1861, a fossil feather was found in Germany in the limestone quarries there. And somehow they dated it to 150 million years old. And by the way, that date has stuck today. Now, how did they get the 150 million years old? If you sit down and think about it, radioactivity wasn't discovered until 1897. Well, this is 1861. How did they get the date of 150 million years old? And that date is still accepted as the correct date for Archaeopteryx today. Well, that feather was found, and then in 1863, a beautiful fossil specimen of the bird Archaeopteryx was found. Again, still dated at 150 million years old. We'll get into a lot more of this. This guy has played such a role throughout history. It's very, very interesting. But one thing I want you to notice about this fossil, and that is this. He has the position of his head. Have you ever noticed this about fossils, animals at all? If you've gone to a museum, you notice the arched back neck, the arched back head. What does that mean? It's very significant. And that is this. Here's an article. It's called Watery Secret of Dinosaur Death Pose. And that's what it's called. It's called the death pose. And he said this: when paleontologists are lucky enough to find a complete dinosaur skeleton, whether it's a tiny Sinosauropteryx or even an enormous Apatosaurus, there's a good chance it will be found with its head thrown backwards and its tail arched upwards, technically known as the epistotonic death pose. No one is entirely sure why this posture is so common. This is common in the fossil record. But this particular writer says that he thinks it has to do with a dip in the wet stuff. In other words, a watery catastrophe. This is indicative of creatures being rapidly suffocated by sediments. And this is common in the fossil record. You can see this in every museum when you go. Take a look the next time you go into a museum and see some of the fossil animals they have, and notice the death pose. It's quite striking. But there's Archaeopteryx, and you can see it had feathers, it had wings, and there's the tail feather. Now, Thomas Huxley looked at Archaeopteryx, and he said, even though it could fly, and they'd concluded even as early as 1863 that it was a genuine bird. It could fly, and even though it was built like a bird, it had something peculiar about itself. It had teeth. And so he immediately compared it to the dinosaur Compsognathus, meaning dainty jaw. And so his conclusion: but it's a link between dinosaurs and birds. And it is proof that dinosaurs evolved into birds. Now, there's the first mention of the link. You got a small little dinosaur evolving into Archaeopteryx, the first bird. This was what they thought, and this is what they advocated. So here's the picture. You got Compsognathus to Archaeopteryx and to modern bird. Well, never mind that there must have been tens of thousands of intermediate steps of evolution involved in these transitions. Where are they? There are none. We find complete fossil critters in the fossil record, but nothing that would lead us to believe. This is all in the head. Nothing that would lead us to believe that these are actually linked. Not only that, but both Archaeopteryx and Compsognathus were dated at 150 million years old. So we can't be looking at too far of a distance in the evolutionary process here if they're the same age. How can you have that? One's got to be older than the other. So now we've got a problem. And by the way, if you know Genesis well enough, you can remember that birds were created in day 5 of creation, and land animals were created on day 6 of creation. So it's a little backwards. But that's just very simple from Genesis. We don't have to do much scrambling around to figure it out. That dinosaurs did not evolve into birds. Land animals came on day 6. And so it's kind of backwards. So that should take care of the evolution question for Christians now, I would think. But we have to answer another question, and that was this. Okay, so what was Archaeopteryx? I think the best explanation for Archaeopteryx was that he was a strange, extinct bird with no evolutionary history. And these are found all over the fossil record. We have fossils of extinct birds. We have fossils of flightless birds. We have fossils of birds that could fly. And we also have found fossils of modern birds, including penguins, owls, and so on, in dinosaur rock layers. So we've got a big gap in the whole. This is the star witness for the whole evolution of dinosaur to bird. But we've got a big, big problem, because the longer they look and the more astute they get at looking in the fossil record, the more fossils we do uncover that shouldn't be there. And so it's a real problem. Now we get to this thing called the classification of dinosaurs. This is what I learned. It didn't make much sense to me when I learned it, and I thought, I'm not sure why they embrace this classification system, but they still do. This was brought about in the 1800s. And so let's start with the Saurischians, okay? The Saurischians, and then the Ornithischians. Okay, so we'll start with the Ornithischians first. That means bird-hipped. Now, birds have their own hips. These dinosaurs had their own hips. So I'm not sure, and this puzzles a lot of paleontologists, why would they call them Ornithischians? They did not have bird hips. But it includes the ceratopsians, the horn-faced dinosaurs, includes the ornithopods, bird-footed, and it's amazing there because these dinosaurs don't have bird feet. That's another very interesting anomaly. They don't have bird feet. They have their own feet. And you have the pachycephalosaurs, the boneheads, and then the stegosaurs, which is the plated dinosaurs, and finally the ankylosaurs, which is the armored. Now, those are the Ornithischians, or bird-hipped dinosaurs. Now we move on to the next category. The dinosaurs are divided into these two categories. These are the Saurischians, and they're called lizard-hipped. Well, this makes no sense either, because lizards have their own hips, and these dinosaurs had their own hips. But at any rate, they're divided into the sauropods, which means lizard-footed, and none of the long necks have lizard feet. If you've ever looked at some of the skeletons in museums, they don't have lizard feet. They have their own feet. And then you have the theropods, which are called beast-footed. Now, this makes a little more sense. They have these three awfully-looking, three-toed feet. Beast-footed. That's what that means. Now, dinosaurs are thought to have given rise to birds. Which category would you choose to claim that the descendant must have come from in order to produce birds? Which dinosaur descendant would you choose if you looked at these two groups? Anybody? Well, you'd probably be looking at the Ornithischians, wouldn't you? I mean, those are the bird-hipped dinosaurs, so you'd think, well, birds came from the bird-hipped dinosaurs. Well, no chance. They came from the lizard-hipped dinosaurs, and they gave rise, of course, to birds. And this has prompted this comic from me. decided to invite my family over for Thanksgiving dinner this year. And this one I thought was very funny. And we wish to thank evolution for slowly turning some species of dinosaurs into a walking ball of meat with a tiny head. Now, dinosaur to bird evolution was shelved temporarily because of this next big event that went on called the Great Dinosaur Rush. Have any of you heard of this, the Great Dinosaur Rush or the Bone Wars? It's a very sad piece of history, but on the other hand, too, it's a very funny piece of history. It basically lasted for almost 20 years, and it was between these two men here. This first one on the left here had kind of an unfortunate name of Edward Drinker Cope. That was his name. And the next guy is Othniel Charles Marsh. One writer writes this: by the end of the Bone Wars, both men had exhausted their funds in the pursuit of paleontological supremacy. Now, Edward Drinker Cope has been named one of the fathers of modern American paleontology, credited with the discovery of 56 new dinosaur species. He had no formal education past the age of 16. Now, kids, you see, don't worry about your education, okay? That's not what it teaches, though, does it? But he was certainly on the big hitter list here. He supposedly discovered a lot of dinosaurs. Othniel Marsh was credited with the discovery of 64 new dinosaur species, born into a poor farming family. He's financed primarily by his uncle George Peabody, and you got it, it's the Peabody Museum. So he kind of worked his way and found the dinosaurs and put them up in the Peabody Museum. This is Marsh's dig team. There you see Marsh in the background. You notice they're all carrying Winchester rifles. Well, this was right around the time of the Great Sioux War, and so there had to be some real care taken. You had to kind of dig with one hand and keep your rifle in the other, because they all went out west to do this. But he was the guy who discovered the great Brontosaurus. How many of you are familiar with the Brontosaurus? See, this is where most of you are. Sure, Brontosaurus, the great thunder lizard, right? He now exists in science only as a casebook example of phylogenetic inference run amok. It is also a casebook example both of how we sometimes let our prejudices guide our decisions and how scientific competition is not always a good thing. This is a writer in this book, Hunting Dinosaurs. Here's the problem. When his team sent back a bunch of bones to him from Wyoming, they sent back this critter without any head. You can see there is no head, and also no front feet. Now, Marsh concluded that he had found a new species of dinosaur, and so he named him Brontosaurus excelsus, thunder lizard the great. He, although he was convinced he found a new species, he actually added a head and feet made up of composite parts found a couple of miles away from the actual find. But it didn't matter. What Marsh said went. He was one of the big dinosaur hunters. And Shazam, we now have Brontosaurus, the first sauropod to be seen by the public becomes a cultural icon. All speculative, of course. Now, during this time, too, Sinclair Oil gets in on the act. You've all bought your gasoline, I'm sure, at Sinclair Oil at some time or another. And, of course, who's pictured in the emblem is Brontosaurus, the first sauropod to be mounted and displayed in public. Still there, still used. And then the Postal Service gets involved in the act, and they issue a set of 4 stamps in 1989. And one of these stamps was of Brontosaurus. And the paleontologist went nuts. Now, the public didn't know what was going on. I mean, we're reading in all our books, How and Why Wonder books and so on, it's Brontosaurus. This is one of my favorite dinosaurs as a kid. I was brokenhearted when they took him off the list. And so they fought back with the Postal Service. You're trying to lead the public astray. And the Postal Service saying, well, we're just doing what you told us. And so now the whole mess is out of the bag. What's interesting here, though, is that when they issued the 4 stamps, they issued 3 dinosaurs and 1 stamp of pteranodon, which is one of the flying creatures. Nobody complained that he wasn't considered a dinosaur, but he's not. He's considered a flying fowl of some kind. But no one complained. He's not a dinosaur. What are you doing with him, of the paleontologists? Anyway, in 1868, in an act of friendship, Cope had shown Marsh around a fossil quarry in Haddonfield, New Jersey. Behind Cope's back, however, Marsh made an agreement with the quarry owner to have any new fossils sent directly to him at Yale. Cope would later describe this act as the beginning of the end of their friendship, and the bone wars were in full swing during this time. And this brings us to the first American pteranodons that were found, American pteranodons were found in Kansas in the Chalk Hills. This was Cope's territory. He had been digging there. Well, Marsh gets out there after Cope had left, and he starts digging there. And then they both found species of pteranodon, but now the race was on. So what did Cope do? Cope, immediately after Marsh departed, got into the area and started finding several species of the pteranodon. So he raced back to, in 1872, to present his paper to the American Philosophical Society, describing his Kansas pterosaurs. What did Marsh do? Well, of course, he's the editor of the American Journal of Science, and he put out his stuff a few days before Cope. So he then, according to the rules of science, becomes the actual priority for the guy. You can see what went on here. I mean, these were the guys involved in laying a foundation for all of American paleontology, with these 2 guys. Now, here's the saddest part. Between Marsh and Cope, 38 individual fossil specimens were discovered of the pteranodons. They had claimed to have discovered 19 new species of pteranodon. Through the years, 24 of their discoveries have been reclassified. That's a lot of work for nothing. 8 of the so-called species have been labeled nomen dubium. Now, any of you Latin majors or anyone know what that means? It means this, dubious name, or I doubt it. And you can see that a lot of dinosaurs have been reclassified this way. And then, of course, this is the saddest part. Cope and Marsh were financially and socially ruined by their attempts to disgrace each other. Both scientists left behind many unopened boxes of fossils after their deaths, although between the 2 men, they named 142 new dinosaur species. Only 32 are considered valid today. Now, I don't know what to say about that. That's very disappointing. But these are the guys that set the stage. You all may have heard of Barnum Brown. He's called the King of Collectors. 1902 discovered the first remains of T-Rex in Montana, not far from where I grew up. And then there's this guy here, Henry Fairfield Osborn, famous president of the American Museum of Natural History for over 25 years. Now, during his tenure, there was a tooth that was sent to him, found in 1917 in Nebraska. This is just one solitary tooth. They couldn't figure out what it was, so they sent it to the most famous paleontologist of the day. And he immediately took a look at it and named it Hesperopithecus, or ape of the Western world. Now, right after that, an artist then displayed Nebraska Man. So from this one tooth, we've got a man and his wife and the whole environment in which he lived. This came out in one of the London papers. And not too long after that, it was discovered that this was the tooth of an extinct pig. Now, Osborn was the guy who sent this next man into China. He was my hero as a kid. He died in 1960. Roy Chapman Andrews, and many think he was the model for Indiana Jones. You could see it. I mean, the guy was an adventurer. He went all over the place and went to some very dangerous places. But you can see the revolver on his hip. The only thing he's missing is the whip, that Indiana Jones used. But he went into the Gobi Desert. He was the first one to take automobiles into the Gobi Desert. And he'd send a stream of camels ahead with supplies and gasoline and so on. But he was sent there by Osborne to find remains of man's evolution. Osborne was convinced it was in China that man evolved. Well, he found no human remains at all in China, but he did discover the first dinosaur eggs in 1923. There you see the Gobi Desert. I would not go there. But here's the other thing that you don't know much about. You know what else Roy Chapman Andrews discovered in China in dinosaur rock layers? Mammals. Now, this is not some little dinky mammal here. This was a critter, a rhinoceros, a huge rhinoceros that he found in the same dinosaur rock layers. Now, that to me is astounding, and that was withheld for years. I only discovered this when I accidentally ran across the article from a 1930s magazine. So money ran out for paleontology during World War I and World War II. And let me just cover one more, and then we're going to break here because I know we wanted to do a panel here. But shortly after World War II, things kind of died down with the whole dinosaur interest. After all, there was a lot of stuff that had gone on before World War I and World War II. There were a lot of specimens that were sunk by German U-boats. They were headed for museums. All these guys were still looking, of course, in different parts of the world. They'd ship bones over on boats and they'd get sunk. So a lot of the discoveries are at the bottom of the ocean. But there were two guys in particular that revived the whole desire to know more about dinosaurs. In fact, it's called the Dinosaur Renaissance. And it was Ostrom who discovered Deinonychus, meaning terrible claw. Now, how many of you have seen Jurassic Park? Have you all seen Jurassic? Yeah, I know you had. What was the name of the dinosaur in that movie? You remember he chased the kids around in the kitchen? You remember that? After I saw that, it scared me to death. I said, no way I'm letting my kids see that movie. What's the name of the dinosaur? Yeah, that's what they said. It was Velociraptor, right? Wrong. It was Deinonychus. Velociraptor, turns out, was 16 inches high. And I've got a skull of Velociraptor in my museum. The skull is about that long. So an ankle biter is really what he was. But Velociraptor, I think the name just sounds more ferocious. And so the movie portrays him as Velociraptor, and the kids bite it, parents bite it, and after all, science gets it right, right? And one of the most famous characters in that whole, he and Ostrom were together, was this guy named Robert Baker. Dinosaurs had feathers, get over it. And this is the guy also that every time he goes out hunting dinosaurs' bones, this is what he does. This is his chant. Teeth and jaws and vertebrae appear before my eyes today. And he said, we do that in a rhythmic way until we find bones. Now, I don't know about you, but maybe that's my fault, but I don't pray before I go out and find bones. I do pray that I wouldn't run into a mountain lion and a rattlesnake and a big spider. Those are the things I'm scared to death of out there. But I don't sit there and chant, teeth and jaws and vertebrae appear before my eyes today. This is what he does. Now, Robert Baker is one of the foremost paleontologists today. By the way, for you guys from Kansas will love this. You know where he lives? Boulder. Yeah, he lives in Boulder. But he's one of the premier paleontologists today. And this stuff goes on and on and on throughout paleontology. My time is out here. I know there were a number of other things I wanted to go through, but let's have that panel discussion in case there are other questions that come up here, to not distract from that. Anyway, the whole study of paleontology is rather an exciting study for me, because I've witnessed now, I've been at this for over 40 years, and I have witnessed the changes that have gone on in paleontology and geology. Back when I took geology courses, I had a professor that back then, plate tectonics, I'm sure you've heard of it, The word didn't exist back then. They believed in continental drift. Some of them did. And the professor I had thought it was complete heresy. So it shows you the changes that have gone on in thinking through the years. And like I said before to others, geology is really about 20% science and about 80% ideas. And that we've got to teach our kids how to discern the difference between the science and the ideas. And I think that's what's causing the major confusion among our families. And we've got to stop it. We've got to do a better job of teaching our kids the difference between those two and how to stand up for what is right and true.
All right. First, Patrick, when people think of the word evolution, typically I've always been this way. Most people, they think of Darwin in the realm of biology. After listening to your talk, though, it seems like the concept of evolution extends beyond what most people think of. You're including geology, and I was hoping you could expand on that a little bit. What exactly is the concept of evolution? Is it more than just Darwin?
Well, of course, today when people talk about evolution, it makes sense to them because obviously things do change. That's what the word means. It just means to change. And but what Darwin was saying was that things would change significantly given enough time to produce brand new forms of life. Now that was initially how it was viewed. That was really taken from Lyell's idea that the Earth, he never used the word evolve, but that the Earth had changed over perhaps hundreds of millions of years to produce the rock strata and so on. Only later did it get applied to now the evolution of the universe. Very little was known about the rocks below this period called the Cambrian layer, which has all of it's still a mystery today. In fact, on the top 10 mysteries in geology, the Cambrian explosion, the explosion of life, just appears in this bottom layer, all formed, and there are virtually no connections between that layer and in the rocks below. But now they've gone further and further and further and further down, and there's still nothing, but they still refer to it as evolution of now the cyanobacteria into the major forms of life and so on. So when you go to Yellowstone this summer, if you'd go on the trip with me, I'd take you around all the guys in the hot pools, and the scientists out there are studying the cyanobacteria. That's what gives the colors to all of the hot springs and so on. And the reason they're studying them, I thought it was some big medical reason. They're studying to find out how life evolved. And they look at cyanobacteria as virtually unchanged for the last almost 4 billion years. So now evolution has gone beyond the fish and the amphibians and the birds that Darwin knew, and it's gone all the way back down to almost 4 billion years to the first cyanobacteria. Of course, there's no way to tell how old those critters are. And of course, they've remained unchanged for 4 billion years. So that's kind of, it's kind of evolved. If evolution has evolved, yeah.
So this question will be for both of you. We'll start with you first, Patrick. I've heard both of you say at one point in your lives, you had more faith in evolution than you did in the Bible. So the question is, what role did creation play in your conversion to becoming a Christian believer?
Actually, it didn't play anything. What had happened was, because of that one answer I told you about, I drifted away from faith in the Bible. I knew there was probably a God, and I knew that I was accountable to him. But it was because my life just got totally messed up when I was in college. You know, here I was a senior in college, and nothing about what I, cherished in evolution was helping to answer any of the questions. That's what made me a Christian. I turned to Christ. Then I decided I have got to resolve this issue, because now I've got two things facing me. I believe the resurrection was certainly a miracle, and I once believed, at least I thought, the earth was 4.6 billion years old and life had evolved. So Genesis is telling me something different as I read it. So I've got to resolve that. And that was the big step for me after I became a believer. I call it my second conversion.
And Dave?
Yeah, I was raised in a very liberal religious background. Our family had a very good education as far as technically. And I traveled as a young boy with a very renowned paleontologist who'd been a professor at Nebraska, here at the University of Kansas and Oklahoma. So I went around on all these digs with him. He gave me the tools, the hammer and everything. So I assimilated all this evolution concepts when I was uncritical. And being in a liberal church, there was no, we didn't really believe in the Bible per se, even though I got my God and Country Award, which was a 2-year process. I had to read all the scriptures, every book in the Bible during that period of time. But I didn't, the church never raised the issue, so I didn't have that until it was later, and I became a believer still as a Darwinian evolutionist. I still hadn't seen this. I saw the need for Christ, a need for salvation, because I was an achiever and I could never achieve moral excellence at the level that I felt was acceptable to God and as a believer. And it wasn't until later I got into a heated discussion. I was even in seminary as a Darwinian evolutionist at Dallas and got in a heated discussion with another fellow there who had a scientific background my first year, and he raised the question, how do you agree, get these to harmonize between evolution and the most powerful law we have in science is called increasing entropy. It's Einstein considered it the most powerful law in science. The entropy is just an interesting term for order, a disorder, and it's always the increasing disorder in everything you do. We never had evolution, even in my scientific background at MIT, we never used it because it's unusable. Everything's going to disorder. We'd have a perfect, ideal is a perpetual motion machine, and that's not even going upward, that's just maintaining it. And so I began to work this problem, and then that's when the conflict came out. I went back to my professor. I'd taken a small course. I was only 4 guys in this course of working out this law, doing calculations like a brick at this temperature would, if it vibrated in the same direction, it would go right through the ceiling. We worked it out, and it was like 10 to the 36 years. Well, the universe is only 10 to the 10th years. Anyway, so I began to work with this other guy who's also there. What was the probability of getting a protein molecule out of the whole universe put in ideal conditions like the Miller-Urey experiment that was done to prove you could form amino acids? Well, we couldn't even get it in using the whole universe in ideal conditions, spark chamber, reducing atmosphere, no water. Couldn't get it in less than 1 protein molecule, even in 10 billion years or 20 billion years or 30 billion years. So I called up my professor and I said, Professor, this is an MIT professor, we got a problem here. I just made a fool of myself. We cannot have evolution taking place according to this second law. And he says, well, it's a real problem. And he says, but what's your choice, special creation? And I said, well, he says, that's philosophically unacceptable. I said, Professor, as you know, I'm not interested in philosophy, I'm interested in science. I said, scientifically, it's impossible that you can even get 1 protein molecule out of 10 to the 80th particles in the universe in 20 billion years. Well, he says, that's a real problem. And I said, yeah, it's a real problem, but even with 1 protein molecule, you aren't even to life or anything else. He says, well, I have other things to talk about, and he hung up on me. So but it was the beginning of my struggle with how do I harmonize the scriptures and these scientific concepts that were taught, but that are just scientifically impossible.
Patrick, this next question is for you. A lot of church leaders say that the age of the earth that we're undertaking tonight, it's kind of a side issue. It really doesn't matter whether God used evolution or millions of years to create, and that the gospel really is what we should spend our time on instead of topics like this. So how do you respond to that charge?
Well, I think, first of all, I agree with him. It's not necessary for salvation. It doesn't. A person who believes the earth is 4.6 billion years old and has genuinely put his faith in Christ for salvation the person is saved. I don't ever argue against that. I think there's two issues here. Number one, I don't, in my particular life, now that I've grown in my faith, I realize that I'm not here to serve myself. So I'm not here to build up my own faith. I'm here to help others believe. And I may be comfortable with a 4.6 billion year old earth, but there will be a lot of other people who have a lot of other questions. Those are the people I need to be concerned about. I think the second thing is that Jude tells us that we are to contend earnestly for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, as I look at that, obviously, when we talk about the faith, I think ultimately we narrow it down to belief in Christ for salvation. That's the faith. But in contending earnestly, how do you do that if you're not building a proper foundation for it? And I think you used the passage earlier about destroying every speculation and thing raised up against, every lofty idea raised up against the knowledge of God. So it concerns me that we're only involved in part of the battle. If it wasn't the case, then why don't we just put a set of alarm speakers on a car like they used to do in the old days and ride up and down the streets blasting John 3:16? Seems to me everybody hear the gospel and they become a believer. But there's more to it. God does work in the mind too. And so when we contend earnestly for the faith, we want to take out everything that would in any way destroy or undermine the faith that we're trying to preach to the people. I can't tell a person, Jesus saves you, if he's convinced that Jesus didn't exist. What's the point? I've got to back up a bit and lay a different kind of a foundation. That concerns me a lot with that thinking.
Dave, this next question is for you. So you received a degree in science from MIT, one of the most highly respected institutions in the world, and yet here you believe in a young earth. Surely, like I had a pastor a couple weeks ago tell a friend of mine, Scott's just rejecting science. Surely you've had that charge levied at you. You are rejecting science. So is a universe that's billions of years old based on what science says, or is it on what scientists say? And can you differentiate for us?
Well, I had an odyssey to go from this billions of years, because even back when I was a student in the 50s and 60s, that was a basic concept that the universe is billions of years old. And it was a steady state for a while, then it went to the Big Bang Theory. As I made this odyssey, I've been forced by science to come to this young universe concept, that it's less than 7,000 years old, and it was a difficult thing to change in that, but I was forced by the science. And as I grew in the thing, it began with the laws of science, that you have a supernatural beginning to the universe. It doesn't tell you how long ago, but it's a finite time ago. Then I ran into the problem of the fossils and dealing with those, the dating systems. I started to look under the dating systems. First of all, you can't date a fossil because the calcium in there isn't the calcium of the bones, it's mineralized. None of the sedimentary layers it's not original material, so you can't date them. And then you start looking at the ways of radioactive decay and everything, and you realize that this is all bogus. You have two samples. One of them will say it's 45 billion years old. The other one says it's 45,000 years old. Then you have things like Mount St. Helens more recently, since 1980, in which we know that exploded. The deposits were laid down in 1980, and yet they date between 250,000 years old, and most of them are 1.5 million to 2 million years old, using argon to argon, which should give you a much younger deal, because the argon's going to escape. That should be the product of the decay. And you're saying, what's going on here? Or on the Grand Canyon, the lower layers are younger than the older layers, a mile above them. And you say, what's going on here? None of the stuff makes sense. And then you look at the layers. I work in hydrology. I dredge and was kind of a master at that. You see these geological layers. before the next layer is laid up, you should have erosion in it. Then the next one's laid up. If it's for long periods of time, these are all laid down by fast-moving water over large surfaces, and they're done quickly. And some of them are bent dramatically, thousands of feet bent in curves, and you can't do that. It had to be done bent when it's soft. The Grand Canyon had to be cut through when it was soft, just like at Mount St. Helens with the little Grand Canyon there. All these things indicate very short, catastrophic events. So a period of time, I'm coming back, and even the starlight issue, realizing this stuff was developed 150 years ago, that the speed of light changes with the strength of the electromagnetic fields, and in deep space, light will travel at nearly infinite speeds because your electromagnetic medium is almost zero in those places. As it approaches a celestial system, it slows down, it'll bend, just like you see in a mirage, you'll see the light bending, and that's because it's changing the density of electromagnetic fields. It's in air and those things. All these phenomena, all you say, is someone asleep at the wheel? And I used to have debates up here at the University of Kansas with these cosmologists and physicists. I can't get a debate anymore because when you do, pretty soon the crowd's laughing at them. I think they suffer from what I call intellectual incest. They're inbreds. And they never get outside of their box in their minds. And when you begin to do that, you realize this is a house of cards. And they're teaching our students that. And yet you can't use any of it in science. None of this evolution or any of this stuff is applicable. You can't use it for engineering in any sense. Nothing evolves upwards. Nothing. We try to minimize its decline downwards. Genetics is doing the same thing. The studies are showing we're not going up, we're going down. We've lost 99% of our species from the geological layers. We're not gaining anything. And even the human race, our genome is going downhill. In 1 century, we can see very strong indications of loss of assimilation of proteins, of these things. Everything we see about us, and I'm saying, how did I get into this? But I was indoctrinated when I was young by people that I respected, and now I'm finding out they were just lying to me. And some of them willfully knew that.
Patrick, this next question is for you. A lot of your apologetics ministry is focused on the younger generation, and it's been said by some people like Ken Ham from Answers in Genesis that if you compromise the plain meaning of the text in Genesis and syncretize it with a belief in millions and millions of years, this will result in possibly an entire generation seeing inconsistencies between what the Bible says and what science is saying, and ultimately it seems like they lose faith in the authority of the Bible. So I was wondering if you could comment on this. Have you seen any valid evidence of this from your point of view? Has this actually happened? Is this really happening with the younger generation?
Well, I think the kids I deal with, especially that would have that view, would be high schoolers. They are, I'm seeing much kind of an angry generation because they have looked to us for answers. And when we don't tell them the truth straight up, then I think that does damage things. And I've seen it there. Now, the younger kids, they're not jaded yet, so they'll believe anything you tell them. So I want to be very, very, very careful when I'm with a lot of the young people. I want them to know that Genesis is trustworthy 100% and that I trust it. And therefore I can be a light and an example to them. The parents are beginning to figure things out too. They're beginning to figure out that it's not all as cut and dried as it seems to be. And they're starting to go back and rework their faith. A lot of them are coming to Christ, and some of them are getting so, just kind of like a light has come on for many of them. And so it's been a wonderful thing to see this, but this is happening on an increasing level, especially as our government and our society is caving in. There are more and more families who want to teach their kids and take that responsibility. And now the big question is, where are they going to get the information, and how are they going to build these kind of ideas and values into their kids. And so it's a huge project. And sometimes I just wonder, man, it wears you out thinking about it. It's a huge project. But we're having a lot of success. Our museum in the Seattle area, we get 800 to 1,000 kids that go through there every year. And they see evidence of the biblical flood. They see evidence of the biblical creation and a God that we're accountable to. And I think if they can see the actual things, touch the bones, handle the minerals and the rocks, and they come away with a much deeper impression that this Bible is not just a bunch of fairy tales, but it's reality. It links up with what they're seeing. Very important to do that.
This is my final question, and we'll take a few questions from the audience. First, Dave, I'll start with you, and then Patrick will let you have the last word. And we kind of touched on this. I did, I think you did. So Romans 10:9 says, if you believe in your heart and profess with your mouth that Jesus Christ is Lord, you will be saved. And I notice this verse doesn't say anything about evolution, millions of years. So could you please both discuss your thoughts on how important what we're talking about is to one's salvation? First you, Dave.
Yeah, I think that when we look at Genesis, all the basic doctrines of the scriptures come from the first chapters of Genesis that are carried in the New Testament. The argument for sin, the need for redemption is always going back to the fall. It goes back to the first Adam, Romans. All of them build off this sequence. And it's interesting that the catastrophes that happened in Genesis, the fall, affected the whole universe. It was due to sin. The flood is a consequence of sin. It was on the earth. The Tower of Babel, a consequence of sin, and it affected mankind. It didn't affect the earth or the universe. So you see that you can understand some of the world around you, but it becomes even more pungent. I think that God has a jaded sense of humor, because I was taught as a student at MIT, I'd learned science as a multiplicity of disciplines, and I was having difficulty. I was in the highest academic housing unit there. We had files, very disciplined deal, and I was struggling because I knew physics was the heart of science. It's the heart of engineering, the heart of about everything. But I could only get a C+ student grades out of that thing, and I was struggling. This fellow got a hold of me. He's not a believer. And he explained to me, he says, Dave, you're having troubles. And he says, let me see. And he'd slapped these problems because he had files of previous exams. He said these professors are paid big bucks to come up with new problems using the same principles. And he says, you have to understand that the physical universe is only made out of two things, matter and energy. And there's only two laws that control that. The quantity of matter in every interaction of matter and energy is conserved, the quantity is. The second one is that in each interaction, the quality always declines. It goes from states of order to disorder because there's more disordered states than ordered states. And he says from those you can develop all of the laws of science. And he showed me that. He regrooved me and he turned me into an A+ student, physics. He says, you can write your own equations, you don't know the constants in them, but using these two laws. Well, I didn't know the origin of these laws until I got to seminary and began to read the scriptures. God has placed those in the first 3 chapters of Genesis. The first law, conservation of matter and energy, ended on day 6. Since that time, we have the same amount of matter and energy in the universe. So you're always going to have the same quantity in every interaction. Secondly, for some way, God was able to maintain the universe from the creation to the fall in some way, just like the burning bush, without any disorder, death. The suns wouldn't have burned out, the galaxies wouldn't have burned out. Somehow he maintained that like the burning bush. But when sin entered in the universe, then he broke off his maintenance with the universe and it began its present decline. The stars started to burn out, the galaxies are dying, we're dying, everything starts to die in the whole universe, and eventually it'll die totally and we'll only be at 4 degrees above absolute zero. Everything will be frozen except for when all the stars and galaxies are burned out. All just be hydrogen and helium will be the only motion. Anyway, that's in Genesis 3, the fall, and it's explained in Romans 8 that it was subjected, and it looks forward to the day when it'll be renewed, the sons of revealing the sons of God. It's tied to our salvation, the fall of the universe and its rise. And if you don't understand the first 3 chapters, you won't understand any science or be able to work the problems that we did. We used those in the Apollo project, by the way, to develop our equations, those 2 laws. And we developed these things for the rockets and everything. It was never printed down. It's the way we beat the Russians, frankly, and did the things that we could solve problems using just matter and energy, no forces, and everything that is taught. And it's all tied together. We could go from mechanical to electrical to fluid to whatever for your spaceship, determine the courses, determine the motion of celestial bodies and everything from it. But God has, like I said, a jaded sense of humor because the part that they consider the least reliable historically and scientifically are the first 3 chapters. They laugh at it. But in reality, God reveals it and it gives you the power to do things you will never be able to do in science without Him.
Patrick, last word, and then we'll take a couple of questions.
You know what I'm going to do? I really like the answer, and I really, that's a very good answer, and there's no way to add to that.
Well, it's about 25 till 9. Are there any questions from the audience anybody would like to ask of these 2 scientists, theologians? One right here.
And this is a question for you, Dr. Nurre.
Dr. Nurre.
And it's up in your part of the country, but I'm not certain exactly where. I apologize for that. But a few years ago, it might have been 2 summers ago, there was a big limestone, I don't want to call it a sinkhole. I'm not certain exactly what it is. It was originally discovered, I think, in the 70s by a professor here at the University of Kansas, where they went down and literally it was over 100 feet deep, where animals had wandered in and dropped into it. Are you familiar with that at all?
Yeah,
they just reopened it here, I believe it was 2 summers ago, but I've not been able to find any information on what kind of critters they've pulled out of there.
Yeah, I think so. I think what you're referring to is out in southeastern Washington. In the midst, there's a huge lava flow out there that is the Columbia basalt lavas, and it's over 60,000 square miles of lava, and some of it's 2 miles thick, and there are no volcanoes. And a lot of the lavas show indications, in geology we call it pillow lava, which indicates that it erupted underwater. So there's a lot of research indicating that the area was covered by a lot of water, and this would explain the limestone. It would also explain some pretty deep holes here and there. And the kind of creatures that they are finding are mostly what we would consider to be ice age type animals. So we're probably looking at a combination of end flood and initial glaciation and then post-glaciation flooding. And of course, that's how the whole scablands of Washington were eroded by a big ice dam that breached in Montana, flooded across and just ripped out sections of Montana, Idaho, Washington, Oregon. I have found Montana moss agates in Oregon. How did they get there? Well, they've come down through that big washout. But I think those are kind of how it all fits together in there.
Any other questions for our panelists while we still have them here? Yes.
Just real quick, could you speak to the disappearance of the dinosaurs?
Yeah. Actually, I'm not so sure they've disappeared. Occasionally, I try to keep track of some of these things that are happening. And obviously, there's some stuff that's, it's a little hard to buy into, but I note it anyway. I had the privilege a few years ago, this gentleman from Silver Spring, Maryland, devoted his life to collecting articles, scientific articles from science journals, going all the way back into the 1800s. And it was his complete set of anomalies, and I was fortunate to be able to get it. Now, this is some fascinating reading of geological anomalies, paleontological anomalies, biological anomalies, and so on, right down the line. And there are reports of these creatures being found and alive and seen in some of these articles. Now, these articles have kind of come and gone. And, but because of the bias that dinosaurs died out 65 million years ago, we don't allow for these kinds of things. The other thing is that the whole idea behind a comet hitting the Earth and causing a great mass extinction, that has really come out of favor with a lot of paleontologists. The main reason being that they say, wait a minute, there were a lot of mammals living at the time of the dinosaurs, and they all survived into the Cenozoic period, or the Cenozoic era, which became the age of mammals. There were crocodiles, birds, modern birds, there were turtles, and a lot of other creatures that survived, plants, and now they're finding flowering plants and the dinosaur poop and grasses, and they've survived. So now we got a real problem here. We're calling it selective extinction now. And so they're really giving up on the whole idea, and that perhaps maybe it's not such a bad idea to consider the tremendous volcanism that was taking place. And so I would look at the end of the Cretaceous period, which is when the dinosaurs supposedly wiped out, as being probably that period of time, right around the time of the end of the flood, when the mountains were raising up, the waters were flowing off of the mountains and beginning to recede off of the earth. And you got brand new tectonic activity happening, volcanism happening at tremendous rates. Yellowstone probably erupted during that time. This crater at Yellowstone, 45 miles long, 35 miles wide. Have you ever been into a volcanic crater of that size and magnitude? Now that is a huge amount of lava and stuff, and you don't even know you're in the crater. Every once in a while you'll see the edge of it. But if a volcano like that exploded today, everything within 250 square miles of its explosion would be obliterated. So it's not hard to see that perhaps a combination of things toward the end of the flood, like the increase in volcanism, climate change brought on by massive amounts of ash into a cooler atmosphere, and producing circumstances where animals would go extinct. So I would think that probably most of the dinosaurs, I do believe there were the kinds on the ark, and there are not many kinds. If you looked at how paleontologists describe dinosaurs here, they're just two basic groups of dinosaurs, and you have about 5 kinds in one, you have about 4 kinds in another. If you have 2 parents and put them on as children on the ark, and then let them go afterwards, for a time they're going to probably increase in population, just like the woolly mammoth did. And then as climates begin to change, then I think probably a lot of what we think of extinction probably happened with dinosaurs and other creatures. But I'm not convinced that they're totally extinct. I have a book on my shelf I read, I was totally blown away by. It was written by a geologist in the 1800s called Catastrophism and the Mammoth. And now this book would never be allowed in class today, but he's, from what I understand, he wasn't a believer. But he records, he has hundreds of records of people who saw the mammoth, woolly rhinoceros, and other kinds of mammals that we say went extinct 20,000 years ago. They saw them just 1,000 to 1,500 years ago. And so I've got to do something with those kind of things. I can't just dismiss it. And so I'm really thinking that perhaps maybe there are some creatures that are still out there. Maybe most of them have gone extinct. We do know that the woolly mammoth just doesn't exist anymore. If there's one creature that epitomizes the ice age, it's the woolly mammoth. Now that makes absolutely no sense to me. Here you got the woolly mammoth. if anybody would have survived the cold weather, you would expect it to be the woolly mammoth. But that's supposed to have been the period when he died out. And I would think that probably climate change after the flood probably is what caused his demise, and many other creatures too.
Could I add something to that, Scott? I hold to the view that the waters above were a canopy around the earth that would give you a uniform temperature over the earth, just like Venus has uniform temperatures at its poles and its equator because it has a canopy. It's more of CO2, but we had a water canopy, and we can hold one up because like here was maybe 62 degrees up above. At 6 miles, it's 50 below, 60 below today, but above that it's 1,200 degrees. You can pump a lot of water into that area, and that would have explained a lot of the fossils. For instance, why in fact, all the geological layers indicate uniform temperatures over the whole face of the earth. Like largest coal beds in the world are found out of tropical plants in Antarctica, in Arctic, all over the world. All of your plants of every age but the ice age, the Pleistocene, is the only one that shows any cold zones. Also, this would load up the atmosphere, so you would have much higher hyperbaric pressures here on the face of the earth, and it would allow for these large animals to live. The largest animal we can sustain, a land animal, is about a 5-ton elephant, 6-ton elephant. If you bring a whale, it can breathe air. Bring it out on a 100-ton whale, onto land, he'll asphyxiate. He doesn't have enough atmospheric pressure. It's like me going up to the top of Pikes Peak. I'm the same person here. I can run really well. I get up there and I pant, and that's why Hannibal had trouble getting elephants over the mountains. But what had happened is with this collapse during the flood of the waters above, then all of a sudden, several things happen. The atmospheric pressure declines significantly, and the large animals, which wouldn't be able to live today. I don't know the extinction of the small ones, but the large ones would all disappear. You would have also, men would have lived a long time, protection from radiation, because that water is the best insulator against radiation that we have practically. That would have disappeared. The lives of men would have dropped significantly. Certain animals, reptiles, plants, also they never stop growing. There's no key in them to say quit growing, so the longer they live, that would explain why you had very large animals and plants in the old days that we don't have today when this pressure dropped down. So you would have a decline in life deals. Wouldn't have had rain before. That's why there was no rain. The rainbow becomes very significant because it comes about after the flood, because then you have temperature zones. You'd also have an ice age because you have very warm oceans, and we know recently that the fossils under the North Pole, the corals there, grew in 74-degree temperatures. In other words, the Arctic Ocean was at 74 degrees temperature. And most of the fossils we have are called marine fossils, like on the top of Mount Everest. The things that grew in warm temperatures, clams and everything on the top of Mount Everest that were shoved up. So this world changed with the flood, and you have this extinction, a large extinction of animals that just simply cannot live in our present habitat and atmospheric pressures. In fact, we use that now in healing clinics, surgeries, convalescence. We use hyperbaric pressures. You don't change the percentage of oxygen, you just pump the pressure up and people heal a lot better. You can breathe a lot better. And also the pterodactyls couldn't fly in today's atmospheric pressures. There's not enough air for lift, and there's not enough atmospheric pressure to run their metabolism to pump their wings. There's a lot of things that changed, but those waters above don't exist today. And they were probably one of the contributors, like it says, the windows of the heavens opened up and the fountains of the deep burst forth. So it was one of the sources for the flood.